Shiur on Chassidut, part of our Chassidut workshop, which we've been this is part of our Chassidut workshop, which we started at the beginning of the year. We're going to pretty much make a break. We're going to do something different that we've done up until now. We've been dealing with, some people might call it Musar, or using the Chassidic texts to look inside ourselves and to explore what that means for us in a real way. Now I want to backtrack a little bit and give you a little bit more access and more exposure to other parts of Chassidut. Other parts of Chassidut may be a little more familiar, maybe a little more difficult. The first section on the page in front of you is from Rabbi Lamb, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb from YU. You might have heard of him. He wrote a book published maybe 10 years ago. You didn't get one? Here's one. On Chassidut. And he writes there about his own misgivings. Because you might have heard of Chassidut, and maybe by nowadays already, in the last 10 years, a lot of movement has happened in the world in terms of people being open to learning from the Chassidim. But as you can see in the first paragraph, it was not easy for him to gain access and to mine from the Chassidic world some of the beautiful insights, which, as I said, he wrote a whole book on it, and it's the first real text in English. It's called Chassidut, in English, in which he has excerpts from, and a discussion of different Chassidic masters and their teachings. But he writes there in the introduction, as you can see, I don't think we have to read it, he says, at first he was dismayed by comparing the wealth of ideas and the beautiful concepts which he found in the original Chassidic masters, and then he compares it to today. When you think about Chassidut, you think about this Sanzer group is fighting with this Satmar group, and you say Chassidim, you think black hats and courts, and maybe nowadays you think of what the press has been inundating us with in Israel. You might have heard about these attacks in Beit Shemesh of different Chassidim spitting on women, and all sorts of, some of it is libelous, of course. It's expanded. It's expanded in Israel to include anybody who's other than Chiloni left wing. And I'm pretty angry about it. I don't want to talk too much politics, but I feel that it's so obvious. There's been a media smear campaign against the Haredi world, against the ultra-Orthodox world, as it's called. And it comes today, the cat is out of the bag, because the press made a big deal of the announcement of essentially the leader, a new leader of a new party that's being formed, which essentially its main platform is anti-Haredi, anti-religious. Yair Lapid, if you heard about it. In any case, we have yet to see what's going to happen from it. But enough said. Rabbi Lamb speaks about how those ideas, those beautiful ideas and very powerful spiritual ideas and even philosophical statements, what does that have to do, as he says here, with the rank intolerance, the destructive loyalties? He felt this is a desecration. But he says as he got a little older and more mature, and as time passed, he learned to weigh the good against the bad, valuing the former and rejecting the latter, especially in the various contemporary revivals. So we're going to try to do the same thing. Today we're going to focus on one aspect of the Chassidic world, which maybe is the most accessible. But perhaps the hardest to understand that it's really something of value. It was a big innovation in the Jewish world, which always valued study, textual study, Talmud, the codes. All of a sudden, these great Chassidic rabbis, who many of them were no slouches, some of them actually were quite great scholars, all of a sudden, they started to tell stories. instead of giving a lecture on Torah, instead of giving a detailed analysis of a piece of Gemara, they told stories. The first place we want to relate to that is from the most famous story that the Chassidim tell. Here's here at the bottom. Shmuel, why don't you read it for us? It's a story about the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Chassidut, I mentioned him before, of course, and the story goes, before you start reading, the story goes that it's been told in many different forms. Used to be that one of the greatest pains, the greatest difficulties that people would have would be a young couple who was childless. And the young mother wanted to be a mother. The young bride wanted to be a mother, and for some reason she couldn't conceive, and they would go to request from the great holy rabbi that he would intercede on their behalf and pray for them. And miracle after miracle, if he was a truly great, pious man, he managed to intercede on heavens, and they answered. They heard his prayers, and she would have a baby. So one of the people that they would turn to was, of course, the Baal Shem Tov. And Shmuel, go ahead and read for us when he had a difficult task.
When he had a difficult task before him, he would go to a certain place in the woods, light a fire, meditate in prayer. And when he had set out to perform was done. When a generation later, the Magid of Mezerik was faced with the same task. He would go to the same place in the woods and say, "We can no longer light the fire, but we can still speak the prayer," and what he wanted done became reality. Again, a generation later, Rabbi Moshe Lab of Sasov had to perform this task, and he too went into the woods and said, "We can no longer light a fire, nor do we know the secret meditations belonging to the prayer, but we do know the place in the woods to which it all belongs, and that must be sufficient." Insufficient it was. But when another generation had passed, and Rabbi Israel of Rutzin was called upon to perform the task, he sat down on his golden chair in his castle and said, We cannot light the fire, we cannot speak the prayer, we do not know the place, but we can tell the story of how it was done. And the storytellers add the story which he had the same effect as the actions of the other three.
Okay, so we have here the first 4 generations of Chassidut from the Baal Shem Tov. His primary pupil, the Magid of Mezrich, who actually wrote the first Chassidic Sefer, Magid Rav Yaakov. He essentially was the mastermind behind the plan of the spread of Chassidut, and his disciples went out and spread Chassidut all over. In the 3rd generation we have Moshe Levi Sasov, and the 4th generation Rabbi Yisrael Mirizhin. Okay, so we have 4 generations here, and in each one they feel we're missing something. It's like Moshe was closest to Har Sinai, but we're a little farther, and the next generation's a little farther, the next generation's a little farther. We feel that we've lost something in the process. So too here, the Chassidim feel, and there's different versions of this story. I don't like this version, because why could the Magid of Mezrich no longer light the fire? I think lighting the fire is easy to do, but the problem was, the version I prefer is that they couldn't find the right exact spot in the forest. And the next generation, well, if you can't find the exact spot in the forest, then the next thing, the hardest thing, is to pray with the same meditations, with the same kavanot, the same holy thoughts that the previous generation could do. And finally, we get to the last generation, which we can't say the prayers with the same intense kavanah. We don't know where the special spot is. We can't even light the fire, as they say here. But all we can do is tell the story. There is another version which has one more stage in which we can't tell the story, but what would the Baal Shem Tov do besides light a fire? He would sing a nigun. He would sing a nigun, and that was the last thing that remains. We can still tell the story and sing the nigun.
It's the same effect. What does that mean?
Meaning, for example, if this young bride could not conceive, after the rabbi prayed on her behalf, sang on her behalf, meditated on her behalf, then she could conceive and she would have a child. It was the prayer was successful.
It was not enough to tell a story?
Exactly. All we have to do, we don't have to pray anymore. We don't have to find the specific spot and have those special meditations. All we have to do is tell the story about how the Baal Shem Tov did that, and that has a spiritual impact. It has power, just like the prayer itself. So why is this so? Where do we get off? I mean, one thing to make the big switch from, okay, I'm going to learn Torah, and that's the holy act, and I'm going to do mitzvot, and in that merit, Hashem will answer my prayers. That's the standard approach. Along to the Baal Shem Tov, and he said, you know what, prayer, even if you're not such a scholar, you can pray to God, and the special holy Baal Shem Tov, of course, he could pray better than anybody, and his prayers were answered. But somehow that this prayer, or this approach to God is so powerful that even if we don't actually know how to say the special kavanot in the prayers, all we do is tell the story about it. That in itself is a spiritual activity. How is telling a story a spiritual activity of such potency that it actually can have an effect and change the decree and actually have the prayers heard? Okay, so next page I want to give out to you discusses this a little bit. It's actually from a collection of teachings of Rav Shlomo Karlibach. And the most famous storyteller of all of the Chassidic teachers was who? Anybody heard about?
Magid.
The Magid? No, not really. The Magid of Mezrich, actually, he's known as the Magid because he taught in communities, but and he would give lectures which exhorted the people to do tshuva. That's what a Magid was, somebody who would give these fiery lectures. But the Magid of Mezrich actually was quite the scholar, and he taught quite in-depth philosophy. You might be thinking of the Magid of Dubno, the Dubno Magid. He was not a Chassid at all. The Dubno Magid was actually during the time of the Gra, and he was known for his stories. It's true, his parables. Mishlei Yaakov is the name of a collection of his parables. But the most famous of the Chassidic rabbis who would tell stories was Rabbi Menachem of Breslov. Rabbi Menachem of Breslov has many Chassidic stories, and he actually took this to a new level. He made up stories. We're going to study one or two of his stories today, but before that, to get a little understanding of what where this is coming from. Some people mention also when you dream. We know that dreams are supposed to be 1/60th of prophecy. The Gemara in Brachot says. So when you dream, you always dream in a story. Ever noticed that?
I thought it was 1/60th that we were dead.
It's also true. It's also another Gemara. He says that you dream, you always dream a story. It's very interesting. And when who are the holiest people? We always refer to children. Right? Children, they have not been tainted by sin yet. Children love stories. Maybe there's something uniquely spiritual and pure about a story. Let's read what it says here. Two people came to Yisrael Rajiner. One storyteller, the other one was a great Talmud Chacham who wrote Chidushei Torah. So he said, I wanted to listen to the storyteller first. When he leaves, his shamash asks him, Shalom David, hi, here you go. We started, but you can catch up pretty easily.
Two other guys are coming.
Oh, good. Okay. So when he leaves, his shamash asks him, why did you take the storyteller before the Talmud Chacham? This is really, really anti-Talmud Torah. This is anti-Misnagdish. This is so Chassidish. He says to him, well, I'm just doing it at the end of the page, on the left-hand side, about 10 lines up. I'm just doing it the way Hashem did it in the Torah. Hashem started the Torah with stories. told the story of creation, the story of the flood, the stories of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the story of slavery, the story of redemption. Then he led us before Sinai. After he told us all these stories, he gave us laws. So he continues. Rabbi Nachman said that God created man because he loves stories. The whole story of creation of the world isn't just one big story. All of history, the history of civilization is one long story. Everything we understand comes from our consciousness. Where do stories originate? Imagination. So he's playing off. Understanding is one thing. That's one road to access truth, to access reality, is through our consciousness, through our understanding. But stories use a whole different part of our brain, or part of our psyche. It's the imagination. He says the truth is the story comes from beyond my consciousness, but it flows into my consciousness. The story is really beyond. Again, this like Karabakh language where, it's a little bit, poetic, or sometimes he uses strange expressions. Rabbi Nachman says when you dream, you always dream stories, not theories. When your imagination is completely free, then you dream stories. People sit and tell each other stories, they really become friends. Because a few, again, he doesn't define it. What is the power of a story? But he says, apparently the story has power. Number of phenomenon, he says that people get close to each other by telling each other stories. I mentioned children. He mentions the Torah. Hashem, for some reason, Hashem starts off the whole Sefer Bereshit essentially as stories. Right? That's essentially the first Rashi on the Torah. What's the first Rashi on the Torah? Amar Reb Yitzchak, Lama Patach, Torah. Where should it have started? The story should have started where? The first mitzvah, Chodesh Hazeh Lachem, in Parashat Bo, in another 2 weeks. We could have skipped the whole Sefer Bereshit. There's no laws. Torah, halacha, comes from hora'ah, to teach you laws. What are these stories telling us? So Rashi has his answer. This is another answer, saying that storytelling is another channel through which we can connect to God. We can appreciate God, experience God. Not just the law, that's with our brains, that's with our understanding. Stories is another one. Okay? Questions so far? Comments? Let's start with one story which is from Rabbi Nachman. And again, this is really just going to be a taste. The two go together. Yeah, the two go together. A taste of introducing you to Chassidic stories. And Rabbi Nachman's story is a specific type of Chassidic story. And again, he has many different types of stories as well. Some of them are more esoteric than others. The two I brought here are the ones perhaps which are most accessible, and we'll be able to even understand them with our rational faculty. It's not just a question of, what impact does this have on my neshama? How is this going to connect me to God? But we're actually going to see some psychological insights here. Let's start with the story called The Turkey Prince. Okay? I forgot your name. Shmuel. Why don't you read it for us?
Okay.
Great.
The Turkey Prince. A royal prince once became mad and thought that he was a turkey. He felt compelled to sit naked under the table, pecking at bones and pieces of bread like a turkey. The royal physicians all gave up hope of ever curing him of this madness, and the king suffered tremendous grief.
1 second. Anybody heard this story before?
Anti Thomas.
You have? Okay. It's a famous story. It's called in Yiddish, the original, it's called the Hindik, because a turkey is a Hindik. The story of the Hindik. If you want to be a pure Breslovers, they'll call it the story of the Hindik. We call it the Turkey Prince. Go ahead, Shmuel. Thank you.
A sage then came and said, I will undertake to cure him. The sage undressed and sat naked under the table next to the prince, picking crumbs and bones. Who are you? Asked the prince. What are you doing here? And you, replied the sage, what are you doing here? I am a turkey, said the prince. I am also a turkey, answered the sage. They sat together like this for some time, until they became good friends. One day, the sage signaled the king's servants to throw him shirts. He said to the prince, what makes you think that a turkey can't wear a shirt? You can wear a shirt and still be a turkey. With that, the two of them put on shirts. After a while, he signaled them again, and they threw him a pair of pants. Just as before, he said, "What makes you think that you can't be a turkey if you wear pants?" The sage continued in this manner until they were both completely dressed. Then he signaled again, and they were given regular food from the table. Again, the sage said, "What makes you think that you will stop being a turkey if you eat good food? You can eat whatever you want and still be a turkey." They both ate the food. Finally, the sage said, "What makes you think a turkey must sit under the table? Even a turkey can sit at the table." The sage continued in this manner until the prince was completely cured.
Okay, so comments on the story.
He's still a turkey. Then.
He's still a turkey. But he's a turkey that
Acts like a human.
acts like a human. Sorry?
He's a
His house-trained turkey. House-trained turkey. Okay. The king was thrilled, of course. The king was thrilled that his royal prince at least is a trained turkey. But what else? What other comments? What do we learn from the story?
He slowly brought him back to being human.
How did he do that?
He
How
did
did
it
he do
through
that?
like small steps.
Small steps. Good. Becoming a turkey. Did he actually become a turkey?
Did the prince actually become a turkey?
He lowered him to his own level and then raised him back up.
Yeah.
He lowered himself to
the
other guy's level, and then he, through that, raised him up.
Perhaps
Good.
wild
What
turkeys
else?
at heart.
How so? What do you mean by that? Perhaps wild turkeys at heart. What do you mean?
Like, I don't know. They were all like animals, but act as people. Like humans.
Perhaps there's a certain part of our nature that has to be tamed, that has to be developed, that has to be understood. So there's a few. First of all, the psychological insight that all the prince needed was a little empathy. He needed to be understood, to be. Excuse me. Please turn off your phones before sharing. Always. Second thing is the approach of the Chassidic Rebbe. The Chassidic Rebbe, his job was to bring up his flock, to be able to help them in their avodat Hashem. Tarfon avodat Hashem means the service of God. How is the leader of the community supposed to help people in their avodat Hashem? Well, one of the ways that the master spoke about was that the Rebbe, who's a very holy man and a great scholar, he has to be able to relate to come down and be on the level of his flock, his community, whoever happens to be. And if there happens to be a drunk in the street who's illiterate and a very simple man, the Rebbe has to have the ability to come down, to appreciate where this chassid is, and through that, through relating to him, be able to bring him up. Yeah.
2 points I thought of.
Kevin, yeah.
This is a person who everyone else abandoned help with him, and this sage went to help him.
Mm-hmm. So
Second,
he's not supposed to give up hope on anybody, correct? Yeah.
I just forgot my second point.
Okay. Okay.
I feel like you could tell the story the other way around too.
How so?
That the sage sits under the table with the turkey for a while. And then the turkey prince, and then the turkey prince convinces him that it's really good to be a turkey. And then he also becomes a turkey.
That would be a different story, but that message would be would be pretty destructive, right? Because the story is built around the idea that we're trying to cure, heal,
But
or
I think there's
aid.
truth in that story too, that like they're going down to the level of the drunk.
So that's the next story. That's the next story that I brought you, which makes it a lot more complicated. You know, you say maybe we all are turkeys inside, or maybe we have something. Maybe we should be turkeys, right? If that's part of who we are, maybe we should be turkeys. Who said we should push down the turkey part of us and elevate the side of us which acts like humans? Who says that that's right? Who says it's better to eat with a knife and fork? Right, Moshe? Who says maybe it's better to eat with your hands? You understand why I'm laughing, right? This is a question which is going to be brought out in the next story. So, but it's a good question. Who defines what's objectively normal, right? Or what's best? But the assumption of this story is that the king has a problem, that his royal prince is essentially acting crazy. He's not acting like a prince. He should be a prince. He should be acting like a prince. And he's got something into his head which makes him, he has a need to be different, to act like a turkey. And many times when you're dealing with psychotherapy, you try to attack a question head on, and so you won't get anywhere. You're a prince, and that's what all the other doctors, and this story is not really told so well, it just says all the physicians gave up hope. But I've heard other versions of the story where it describes how one after the other, one doctor came, and another doctor came, and each tried to reason with him and convince him. Says, I'm a turkey. No, you're not. I'm a turkey. You're not. They didn't get anywhere. So if you're just going to use the route of the mental faculties, trying to convince somebody, they didn't get anywhere. There's something called CBT, right? Conditional behavioral therapy. It's all the rage nowadays. The last 10, 20 years in psychotherapy, it's become a very, very popular method of therapy. And this is similar because we don't try to convince you that your beliefs are wrong, but it's called behavior therapy because you help the patient in the case of a debilitating illness, whether it's somebody who behaves in strange fashions. Don't try to, psychotherapy. Why are you behaving that way? Because when you were a child, you were beaten with a rubber hose, and since then you have repressed anger or rage, and you haven't let it out. But this is the standard approach to psychotherapy that we've all heard of. In the last 10, 20 years, this behavioral therapy has been a lot more successful and has come to the fore. And essentially, it's very similar to what Rabbi Nachman is describing here, that let's try and introduce you to other behaviors, the behaviors that you're doing right now, whether it's hand washing or maybe starving yourself, many different ailments that people have. And it may be for each and every one of us, you don't have to go to the extreme of psychological imbalance. We all have behaviors which are destructive behaviors. For some reason we started them at one point, maybe because there was a need, but they're not useful to us anymore. And Rabbi Dr. Twersky discusses this in a number of his books about destructive behaviors we have. And sometimes we could just tell ourselves 100 times, it's not good for me to sleep in. It's not good for me to sleep in. I should get up early in the morning. But the more we talk about it, the less it happens. And if we take a different approach, it says, let's look at the behaviors. Let's try and do a little bit of what you were afraid to do. Each time a little more. And then you help the patient manage to do it without going crazy or without showing him, essentially conditioning him that, wow, this is not so bad after all. I can do this, and there was nothing to be afraid of. Right? So that's CBT, it's called conditional behavior therapy. So this is essentially what the sage, how the sage helps this prince. He says, oh, what? You can be a turkey and still wear a shirt? Wow. And I can still be a turkey. He also gives him legitimacy, which is, the question which we're going to relate to in the next story, in terms of what's legitimate and what's the, what's the objective truth, what's normal. But slowly he wears a shirt and then pants, and then he can eat normal food. You can eat normal food and be a turkey? He says yes. And he manages to help him, bring him back to society, which was the ultimate goal in this story at least, which was something that no other. So why did I bring this story? Because it's an amazing story. It's a wonderful psychological insight of Rabbi Nachman, educational insight. Many times, all people need is to feel. Rabbi Twersky tells a story in one of his books. Here he went on he is still alive. He has essentially an institute for people who are mentally ill. And he once took a group of medical students on a tour of the institute. He introduced him to the different patients, and this guy's been here for 10 years, this guy's been here for 20 years, this guy's been here for 15 years, and this guy's problem, and we haven't been able to find a cure yet. And he showed him this one guy who, did I tell you the story before?
No.
It's a wonderful story. Who every morning, I think I told you, yeah. Every morning he would get up and after breakfast he'd go to the corner of the room and like stand like this. He'd stand like this. And essentially like he was holding up the world. Seemed like he was afraid that if he would sit down or stop, whatever, the sky would fall down. And all day long he would stand like this until they would forcibly take him to bed at night and take him to eat and so forth. And so one of the group of medical students, he had some intuition, and he went over and he stood right next to this patient, and he took up the same pose. And he stood there with him for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. After a while, the patient said to the medical student, "What are you doing here?" He says, "Oh, I'm going to hold it up right now. I'll take over for you. You can go take a break if you want." And he thought about it for a few minutes, and eventually the patient said, "Okay, great." And he went and he took a break. And this is the first time. This is the first breakthrough they had with this patient after years and years and years that I guess no other doctor took that approach. Like, it's very similar to the Turkey Prince story. Something about finding the empathy or coming down, as we said, like the Chassidic Rebbe comes down to appreciate each and every Chassid, each and every member of his community for where he's at. That has a magical power. Has a power from there that somehow that frees the person up, frees you up to succeed in life. Of course, we're talking about now here, introduction to Chassidut. It frees you up sometimes in your service of God. It frees you up to connect to people, to connect to Kadosh Baruch Hu in other ways. So too, many times, we've been talking about telling stories and listening to stories, but essentially I hope we all have appreciated the power of reading a good novel, a good story. It does something for us. What does it do? It's not like I'm not studying it because I need to gain the knowledge. Many times fiction, it's not even real knowledge. Science fiction, for sure, maybe based on some quacky science, some ideas which have no basis in reality. Fantasy books, somehow, reading a story, it does something for us. Somehow it brings us to another channel or another path to connecting to reality or to experiencing reality. And ultimately the same thing in the realm of Judaism and our connection to God. Somehow telling a story has a powerful impact. I hope we all have experienced that the last couple of weeks. We've had perhaps the best story of all time. The story of Yosef and his brothers. It's an amazing story. And there's dreams, right? And prophecies, and there's hatred, and there's almost murder, and then there's revengeance, right? Revenge, and there's bravery, and there's prayer and begging, and it's just an amazing story. And then, of course, there's a great revelation at the end where everything gets turned on its head. What a great story. And we read it year after year after year, and ultimately, of course, we analyze it each time. We try to understand the story a little better with our brains. Why did Yosef do this to his brothers? Why did they say what they said? But I think not everybody's a scholar. Not everybody learns Perush Rashi and Ramban al Torah every year. Sometimes some of them just hear it in reading of the Torah on Shabbat. The story, of course, it has many, many messages inside. Do you think everybody listening to the story can articulate what the messages are? No, but we believe that this story has a powerful impact on you, even if you don't know how to articulate what the message is. Of course, we believe that partially because, or mainly because it was written by Kadosh Baruch Hu. Kadosh Baruch Hu decided to put it in the Torah. This is The stories which Chassidic Rebbes made up were not written in the Torah. They made them up. But essentially, they're, as we saw, Rabbi Yisrael of Rishon said that even though we may not be a Kadosh Baruch Hu, the power of the story is a tool, it's a technique that we can still use and we should use in order to get to the depths of our soul, from where we want to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So somehow there's a power in the story to open us up to experience life, to experience God in other ways that we do perhaps when we're analyzing the text of a Mishnah or a Gemara. Okay, the next story is a shorter story, and this is a real mind bender as well. Olaf, I think you'll like this one a little better. I told this story, if I'm not mistaken, on a Shabbat, on a Suda Shlishit, a couple of months ago when I was here, maybe around Rosh Hashanah time. David, will you read it for us?
Sure.
Read it loudly so the tape can hear you as well.
Excuse me.
It's right there on the same page where we left off.
Oh, that one.
It's called The Tainted Grain. It's a very, very short story, but it's a very deep story. Go ahead.
Okay. A king once told his prime minister, who is also his good friend, "I see in the stars that whoever eats any grain that grows this year will go mad. What is your advice?" And the footnote says that it's a fungi that has LSD in it.
That's amazing. You know, this book is from a book called Rabbi Nachman's Stories, Rabbi Nachman's Parables, Stories, I think. It was published by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan was an amazing scholar. He was actually a well-known physicist. He was a young man. He died at the age of 40. And he was already written up in the top 100 physicists of who's who in physics. This is about, I can tell you exactly how many years ago. You'll have to ask Ari Yaffe, our kitchen manager, because he's named after Aryeh Kaplan. His bris was right after Aryeh Kaplan died. He was, besides being a great physicist, he was also a wonderful, wonderful teacher of Torah. And he was really he wrote many, many books. In 40 years, he almost has 40 books. Many of them are small pamphlets written for the sake of Kiruv. He wrote books for NCSY, if you're familiar with that, on the American scene.
Can you write about meditation?
And one of his primary pet peeves, one of his favorite aspects of Torah, which he tried to revive and tried to bring back into the Torah discourse, he felt was the aspect of meditation. And he has books, Meditation in the Kabbalah, a book called Jewish Meditation, which you're familiar with. He also wrote one of the best translations of the Torah, called The Living Torah, into English. And in there also, so in all of his books, whenever he has the opportunity, he'll mention meditation. He'll mention something about experiencing meditative states. And this is one example of it. He says, oh, there's some wheat. Right away in the footnote, he's going to say, there's some. We know that there's such a type of fungi which can lead you to bizarre experiences. So he was really into the experiences of meditation and all sorts of other experimental stuff. That's why he put it here in the footnote. But for the sake of the Rabbi Nachman story, and we're going to have to hurry up because we're almost out of time, it doesn't really matter what happened. It's a story. It didn't really happen. It's a parable. Go ahead. David, I'm sorry. So again, the story is the king and the prime minister. There's two people. They're the only ones. They figured out that this year's crop of grain, if you eat it, you'll go crazy. But there's not enough food other than this grain. That's the only grain they had. They can't tell everybody, don't eat. Because then everybody will die. But they can't just let everybody eat because then everybody will be crazy. So what are they going to do? So he asked his advisor, go ahead.
Okay. What is your advice? The prime minister replied, "We must put aside enough grain so that we will not have to eat from this year's harvest." The king objected, "But then we will be the only ones who will be sane. Everyone else will be mad. Therefore they will think that we are the mad ones. It is impossible for us to put aside enough grain for everyone. Therefore, we too must eat this year's grain." but we will make a mark on our forehead, so that at least we will know that we are mad. I will look at your forehead, and you will look at mine. And when we see this sign, we will know that we are both mad.
It's a beautiful little solution. Comments? Questions?
I've heard this story to prove people's political points. They think the world's mad and they're right, but they have to act like the world, otherwise the world will think that they're mad. And then they just write them off that they're all mad.
Well, that's not really a proof that they're right or the other guy's right. It's a method of dealing with living in a society in which you hold something very different belief than the general society around you. And to be alone outside of society is essentially not an option, as he says, because essentially if you're the only one, then you're the one that people are going to think are crazy, even though that you know that the other people are crazy. And so one method of dealing with it is, but I don't want to be crazy myself. I don't want to, partake of that grain or those beliefs. I still believe what I believe. So one method is to act like they do, but make a mark on your forehead. At least know you're crazy.
That's not what the story is saying.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The story is saying that we should actually become crazy.
Yeah,
Yes.
that would be norm.
It's not saying that we should stay sane, we should put the grain aside, and then we'll just act crazy so that nobody will know.
Right. Well, so you're going to be crazy, but
It's a new norm.
you'll know that you're crazy. Why is that valuable?
What makes them crazy though?
The grain.
But it's the new norm. If everyone is not crazy,
very
it's
good.
the new norm.
Very good. This relates to what we mentioned earlier. What makes it crazy? Is there something objectively crazy? Or is it just defined as crazy because everybody else thinks one way and I think a different way?
But everyone think different.
So I'm going to leave you with this quandary. I think that I have to finish a little early today. What Rabbi Nachman is trying to say here is that there is value, Olaf, to knowing that you're crazy, even if you're crazy. Just that one element of having the mark on your forehead. And of course the mark on your forehead is reminding us of the mark of Cain, right? The Ot Cain. There's a similar concept of putting a mark. But we don't have time to analyze the story in depth. I want you to think about it. And it has a lot to say about, perhaps Rabbi Nachman is saying that a lot of what's defined as crazy is societally defined as crazy. And the mark on the forehead is enough to enable you to hold on to that little bit of objectivity, of the objective truth, which you need to have. Beyond just fitting in with society, and maybe at some later date, next year's crop will be a normal, untainted crop, and everybody will be able to be cured. But at least you know that this is a stage that you're going through, and it's a question of knowledge and self-awareness and perspective. But as I said, we don't have time to fully analyze it. Maybe at the beginning of the next class we'll discuss it a little more. I do want to go a little further, but this was just an introductory class. Introduction to Chassidic stories. We brought two Chassidic stories of Rabbi Nachman, both with great psychological insight, maybe even educational insight. There's other types of stories, a whole other type of stories which you may be more familiar with, and that's Chassidic stories about the great miracles of the rabbis. The rabbis knew what was going on the other side of the world. They did amazing. Their prayers were answered instantaneously. There's many different types of Chassidic stories, but for an introduction, I think this was a good beginning. Zrat Hashem will continue next week. Okay.